It's very good of you to take the time to come down under to talk to my listeners and readers about the challenges associated with communication and particularly freedom and the monitoring of our communications. And Mike is the executive director of the Foundation for Freedom Online. And I've been doing a little bit of research as much as I could, Mike, on you. And it's interesting to just see your career trajectory. And I thought you might just outline to listeners and readers. I think you studied law originally, is that correct? And then you've gone from there through the State Department into the current position you're in. So can you just outline a little bit of your own background?
Sure. So I was a corporate lawyer in New York for about 8 years, working primarily on finance and mergers and acquisitions and private equity funds and hedge funds. And I was living that life, and the 2016 election happened in the US. And I thought it was a very fascinating whirlwind of policy. And a lot of the things that I saw there wove together a lot of the tech interests and business interests and policy interests that I had. I represented mostly technology companies in corporate law. I then went on to work for the federal government. I moved to DC, and I joined the White House. I was a speechwriter for Donald Trump. I also advised on White House tech policy. And then from there, I was a big tech diplomat for the State Department. I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Communications and Information Technology, which is a long way of saying everything that touched the internet, I ran diplomacy for, which involved formulating and negotiating U.S. foreign policy. And it was in that capacity that I really saw up close and personal the intersection between big government and big tech companies. And I found this to be something of a moral monstrosity, given that U.S. tech companies were so blatantly disrespecting and trampling on the social contract around internet free speech in the year 2020, 2019, 2020. And to see that they were getting favors from the federal government to preserve their monopolies abroad, while then weaponizing those monopolies to suppress the speech of U.S. citizens, I thought was a betrayal of the voters who had voted for that government. So when I left government, I started the Foundation for Freedom Online, which is a nonprofit watchdog that I currently run in order to basically try to bring free speech diplomacy to the world through any means possible.
It's an extraordinary story. I know there's a lot behind that, but Mike, I suppose, like me, you've seen a transition from an age where the internet was just nascent to a situation where it's completely dominating. And now, of course, there are so many controls behind it. And everything has changed really since that time that you came into the Trump administration. And one of the things that's been evident is the extraordinary amount of money behind a lot of different areas of the internet that we just don't see. It was certainly fascinating to know that the amount of money that came in around the 2020 election was very significant, wasn't it? In terms of the Facebook founder, and that the money that came in to put a finger on the scale of the election at that particular time was very significant. And I think Zuckerberg spent something like 400 million, an extraordinary sum of money anyway, to fund a range of so-called election voting integrity sort of projects, but really was to get Democrat votes into the system, for as far as I can see. So there's extraordinary wealth behind the things that we see now that have led us into a situation where we see monitoring and suppression of information and so forth. Can you just outline some of the things that you saw internally when you were in the Trump administration?
Yeah, we have something in the federal government. So what you're referring to, I completely agree with. That was with Mark Zuckerberg's foundation pumping money into civil society nonprofits for the purposes of tilting the election towards Democrats in that respect. And that has its own sort of moral edges. But the thing that I find even more flagrant and wrong on so many levels is when the government itself uses the people's own resources to do it. And we have a little trick in the US government called capacity building. And this is a nice way of saying when the US government is not allowed to do something, or it would create bad press on the US government if the US government was caught doing it, we build up the capacity of an outside group to do it. We call it capacity building, is this nice little lovely name on it, but it's essentially the creation of cutout institutions to do dirty work that the government can't or doesn't want to get caught doing itself. And so when it comes to things like control over internet speech, the civil society capacity building done by the US government stretches into the hundreds of millions of dollars across all of our major government agencies, who all put their own purse strings on that, from our National Science Foundation to our Department of Homeland Security, to our Department of Justice, to our Pentagon, to our State Department, all funding essentially a kind of NGO swarm army, as well as a sort of university censorship mercenary army, who all get millions of dollars from government agencies to do the kind of censorship work that the First Amendment would prohibit the government from doing directly.
It's extraordinary, really. I suppose from my own naive point of view, I thought things were bad, but as I started to look further, you realize that things are much worse than most people realize. And not only is the government monitoring in various ways, various communications, but it's also then putting pressure on big tech to actually monitor and amplify or suppress various messages. And then as you look further, and you have outlined this in this recent report that's come out of the foundation, that there are various universities involved. And as a guy who grew up in universities and was a dean of a university department, it's extraordinary to see the way that the various universities like Harvard and Penn and University of Virginia have been inveigled into this whole story and have been given money, and money has been used within those departments to use and to amplify various messages. And so there's nothing neutral about any of this stuff, is it? It's very clear which direction this is going and what's happening. So it's much more serious than I think most of us understand. And your foundation has just put out this really interesting report about civic listening. And it'd be very good just for people to understand exactly what this civic listening story is, because I think most people don't understand what's happening behind the scenes and the involvement in universities in doing that.
Yeah, so thanks for raising that. Civic listening is a euphemistic rephrasing of civilian spying, citizen spying. It's an attempt to raise a sort of government-backed snitch network among citizens to report each other for misinformation online. See, there are various technological tools that the censorship industry uses to try to achieve the scale censorship necessary to really quash a trending narrative, an emerging narrative, a dissident political movement, etc. Those include the use of artificial intelligence technologies to scan and ban anyone who uses certain keywords or is assessed to have a certain toxicity score with the language they use. But that has proven thus far to be insufficient. So what they're trying to do now is, through this concept of civic listening, is essentially pay the nonprofit or these censorship mercenary firms to onboard hundreds or thousands of people to snitch on private information, on private posts that their friends, family, and in channels that they're in share, so that they can be censored even when the algorithms can't catch them. And the focus of this report at foundationforfreedomonline.com has to do with the penetration of text messages. And in particular, apps. There are apps like WhatsApp and Telegram that are end-to-end encrypted, which means that this encryption makes it very difficult for outsiders to be able to spy on them and therefore to censor them. And the first step in the censorship process is coming across the post, whether manually or having an algorithm detect it. But if something is end-to-end encrypted, you can't really do that. And so one of their concerns is that these private text message apps allow people to evade many of the censorship restrictions on traditional platforms like Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or TikTok, and previously Twitter before Elon Musk liberated many of the rules around speech restrictions there. And so what they're trying to do there, therefore, and by the way, the people who set this up are all creatures of the U.S. national security state, our foreign policy establishment, which is the apex predator at the top of the food chain of the censorship industry. That's our Pentagon, our State Department, and our intelligence agencies. All of our foreign-facing diplomacy apparatuses who have been repurposed inward because they fear being voted out of power, and having a candidate like Trump here in the US or other populist leaders around the world essentially vote them out or vote to materially change or reform the direction of their policies. And so therefore, they've taken the same sort of dirty tricks that they've used to manage the American empire to now manage the citizens of the homeland, essentially treating people from Boston no different than they would treat people in Baghdad. And so these techniques were initially developed to be able to take on foreign population insurgency groups, and they now treat Trumpism here in the US as a kind of insurgency group. But they became very concerned about WhatsApp and Telegram when Narendra Modi won re-election in 2018, 2019, and when Bolsonaro in Brazil won re-election in 2019. They blamed free speech on private text message apps like WhatsApp and Telegram for Modi and Bolsonaro winning those elections. At that point, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube were completely locked down with the ability to promote pro-Modi or pro-Bolsonaro content. The State Department, the UK Foreign Office, and Brussels very much wanted those two candidates to lose. And when they won on the strength of these private text message apps, it set in motion this kind of war on being able to text on these large sharing links, because it's not just texting to your family and friends. On these apps, you can also be a part of channels that can have tens of thousands of people in them and approximate the size of a Facebook group. But Facebook, because it's open and public, they're able to build these AI censorship algorithms and models to be able to censor anybody who talks about a particular candidate or opposition to COVID policies or whatnot. You name it, you can plug it into the AI. And so they had a problem. How do we stop people from being able to text each other? And their answer is we're going to monitor what all the we can't put our AI on this, but what we can do is we can look at the main channels in which these are spreading. So you can basically be part of these news channels or these niche community groups. And we're going to put basically spies in there among our own set. These are, again, government-funded groups, which are mostly run by former intelligence agents or former Pentagon officials, former foreign policy and diplomacy folks, and setting up this network of hundreds and thousands of people to just monitor what's said on these closed end-to-end encrypted groups so that they can then have back channel hotlines into the groups, into the platforms themselves. WhatsApp is run by Facebook, i.e. Meta, and which is completely folded into our own intelligence apparatus to be able to stop the spread of just messages to your own family, friends, and closed groups.
No, it's an extraordinary bit of work that's going on that no one realizes. And is this only possible because of things like the Patriot Act, or is it come under some other official allowance, or is it completely illegal to actually have this process going on behind the scenes?
Whether it's legal is currently being litigated in the biggest free speech case maybe in our country's history, which is a case called Missouri v. Biden. It gets its name from the Missouri State Attorney General's office. Essentially, the head of the criminal justice system of one of our states sued our federal government initially because of the federal government's collusion with tech platforms to censor speech around COVID-19. But that then spiraled into looking at all the other ways that our government was working with tech platforms to censor U.S. citizen speech. We have a First Amendment in this country, which provides an absolute protection against any attempt by the government to throttle, censor, or remove their speech. And that case is currently before our United States Supreme Court, the highest court in our land. The oral arguments on that case begin next month, and the outcome of that is going to ultimately answer that question about illegality.
And Michael, that case won't be handed down until June, is that right?
Yeah, and again, that's still only on the preliminary injunction level. So
Right.
the case will continue regardless of the outcome of this initial Supreme Court ruling. That's going to basically set the stage for probably the 2 years of litigation between that and a final judgment. But even that is going to have a big impact, because if a verdict comes down in June, that's still several months before our major election here in November.
It's interesting as I've delved into this and looked at the report, which I'll put a link to in the newsletter. But the thing that was extraordinary was that there were been inert sounding groups like the National Conference on Citizenship, which was set up in 1953. And there's this guy, Cameron Hickey, who's involved in putting together not only this, heading up this sort of this area, which sounds as though it must be something quite worthwhile, but actually he's actually put in place this algorithmic transparency institute, and that's created this idea of a civic listening course. So there's government money going into all this. There's a government organization putting money into a project that's actually a spying project on the whole of the private messaging system. So it's quite horrifying to see the extent to which this has happened. And Mike, I suppose at the big picture level, as I read material from the World Economic Forum and the United Nations and what's coming up in the Summit of the Future, everyone's in the same story about this misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, and trying to define those and outlaw it, which seems almost impossible, but it's coming at us like a high-speed train. And there's legislation coming in every country to try and suppress free speech. So how do you see this developing, and how do you see this whole situation about so-called misinformation and disinformation being assessed? And we're going to see much more of this in legislative frameworks around the world.
Yes, we certainly are. At the high level, what's happening here is the government is trying to stop the people from voting to change the government. That's what this is, top to bottom, front to back. It is nothing less than that.
Yes.
This is the attempt to completely reverse everything everyone always thought was meant by the word democracy. See, democracy is basically we need to preserve the integrity of the word democracy, because that is what allows the United States to topple governments around the world, even if they're peaceful and not attacking anyone. If they're not committing acts of outward aggression, we use the predicate that they are engaged in internal repression and need a heaping dose of democracy that can only be made possible through a US fomented revolution inside that country in order to topple the government and replace it with a puppet government more pliant to US interests. And by the way, I'm only using this level of invective in my phrasing because it's been turned against the American people. I love my country. I want reform, not a radical revolution. But you can make an argument that US citizens, that this technique that our government did, these dirty tricks, were for the benefit of American citizens up until the year 2016. When they began to deploy this Department of Dirty Tricks to regime change our own government, I think that requires a forceful revisitation of all of those dirty tricks we've done abroad and accountability for those. Because now you can no longer make the argument that's in the US interest, because they do that to the citizens who are supposed to represent that interest. So what's happening here, though, with the mis and disinformation space is media was always controlled until the internet. Always mainstream media since at least when it comes to the United States of America, it has been wrapped up with our war machine and our foreign policy establishment since the dawn of mass media. When World War II broke out in 1942, we created something called the Office of War Information, which rolled up in whole society fashion all modalities of US mass media, everything from our newspapers to our budding TV stations, to radio, to film, to magazines and periodicals. They were all rolled up in this war effort. And when our private mass media ecosystem emerged out of World War II, they all retained their connections to the Pentagon, to the State Department, and to the newly created CIA. This is how we had scandals like Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA had designated editorial slots at all of our major news producing institutions, from the Washington Post to the New York Times to Time Magazine. All three of our major TV stations during the Cold War, CBS, NBC, and ABC, which were all created in the 1940s and 50s, were created by veterans of the Office of War Information at the Pentagon. They all retained those connections. Their distribution was all backed by that. And when the internet came out, it was initially championed by our national security state because it allowed us to supercharge our ability to overthrow governments, because we could build up resistance groups and build up dissident groups by allowing them to build blogs and forums, and then later Facebook and Twitter and YouTube accounts, in order to be able to build a dissident movement in their country to critical mass, to where they could take to the streets and overthrow their government, even if that government controlled the state-owned media in that ecosystem. All the anonymity software
so the Arab Spring and what happened in Ukraine with the color revolution was seen to be the various US agencies behind that whole story as well, by the looks of things.
That's exactly right. And that was considered to be the crowning moment of our free speech diplomacy, the Arab Spring. And Tunisia and Egypt and one country after another that was the adversary government of the Obama administration magically had these sprawling youth revolutions to topple its government through the internet, through Facebook and Twitter. And this is what we used to do when we toppled the government of Serbia through the Otpor color revolution in 1999-2000. The US government paid that political movement $77 million and paid for all of their newspapers, paid for all their journalist outlets, paid for their radio stations, paid for their fax machines. When the internet came out, and the internet was unstoppable in the sense that that governments could not control what was going on the internet if it was hosted on a US server, or if its IP address was shielded by a VPN, and VPN technology was created by the Pentagon. That's where the seed funding for anonymity software came from. So it was all this big, beautiful thing, free speech, for the first 15 years of the internet. And then when free speech on the internet allowed dissident groups within the United States, or within NATO countries, or within Australia, I dare say, to allow citizens to grow channels and subscriberships on par with and even exceeding controlled dynasty, legacy, institutionally attached news outlets, then our national security state switched from an insurgency free speech model around the internet to a counterinsurgency censorship model. And so we're now about 7 years deep into that transition, and are only now really beginning to launch a counteroffensive to that, with what's happening with Elon Musk on Twitter and the House Republicans launching these investigations and subpoenas here in the US, and lawsuits like the Missouri v. Biden lawsuit, and media pressure like what's happening with the now seemingly constant news cycles around the corruption of the censorship industry.
And Mike, is that then exponentially increased because of the capacity of AI in this whole process? Because I can see from what your report says, and this algorithmic institute that's looking at algorithms are determining much of this, aren't they? But also AI must have put an extra capability into this whole area to amplify or suppress various messages coming from particular sources. And of course, the conservative messages are being suppressed in view of the nature of trying to promote a collectivist view. So you can see those messages are being amplified through all parts of the internet. And it's pretty hard to see how that one can fight against that.
I'm so glad you bring that up, because that's actually what started me on the journey that I've been on now for almost 8 years, which is, I initially was not a political person when I was a corporate lawyer. I was an avid chess player, though, and I lived through that era when AI took over the chess world, when Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov. And I was a very young kid then, and was using early chess AI software to analyze moves. And it was very clear to me as a kid that AI was going to overtake the human ability in chess. And the whole time, these sort of older, the people who were the adults in the room were all saying, no, these chess computers, they can beat experts, but they'll never beat masters. Oh, they're beating masters, but they'll never beat grandmasters. They're beating grandmasters, but they'll never beat Gary Kasparov, and then they beat Gary Kasparov, and then it was like a depression fell over the game for a decade as people struggled with the sort of spiritual ramifications of being able to being outcompeted in the a purely cognitive task. And I lived through that. And when I saw in August 2016, this is even before the Trump election had even been concluded, when I saw these, I call them weapons of mass deletion, these artificial intelligence censorship super weapons being developed by DARPA, our Pentagon, and with funding being provided to these outside groups in the US, I screamed to everybody in my contact book that a new Manhattan Project was being developed, that they were developing basically the nuclear bomb to be able to destroy speech online. And everybody who thought they would be able to smart their way out of AI censorship was talking the same way that everybody who I thought didn't have a clue when I was a kid, trying to say that Deep Blue couldn't beat Kasparov. It's you guys don't understand the power of this and what goes into it. It's like trying to outrun a Boeing 747. You're not even in the same class of it. And that was 8 years ago almost. And so I began writing a book and doing a documentary on that. And then nobody would believe me. So I set about this quest to basically prove the case. I'm happy to say that just yesterday in our Congress, 3 separate hearings, subpoenas, and reports were issued on AI censorship. So finally, the dam is breaking on the importance of this. But I want to stress this is not a future threat. This is not this. There are a lot of people talk about AI, like in the future, it's going to destroy us in this sort of Skynet style dystopia. That's not what we're talking about here. When it comes to censorship, it has already been the singular game changer that has allowed the censorship at scale that you live under. Before the year 2016, you could not censor the internet at scale because all speech-related content moderation on the internet was done by human moderation. The only 2 deployments of AI for takedowns of posts were child porn and spam. The technology did not exist to be able to suss out the meaning of speech and scan and ban at scale. That technology had started being developed in 2014 by the US Pentagon and our Central Intelligence Agency and our National Security Agency to try to tackle the speech of ISIS terrorist recruiters when we were said to be experiencing a crisis of a homegrown ISIS threat on Twitter and Facebook. And we developed this technique called natural language processing, NLP. That refers to the natural language that groups use online, that communities, that birds, quote, so-called birds of a feather, use online, that can then be processed in order to automatically amplify or de-amplify that group's speech, because the whole network is topographically mapped in terms of all the connections to each other, the shared keywords they use, hashtags, memes, slogans, prefixes, suffixes. So what happens to create these AI censorship super weapons that can now target any category of speech, any trending narrative, any emerging narrative, any political group, vaccine hesitancy, mail-in ballot dissent, climate change skepticism, you name it. If you disagree with the war effort in Ukraine, all of these have a unique set of stakeholders who get together in the following way. You have these political thought leaders at the top who decide what group or political party or political movement needs to be censored. And in many respects, sometimes now that's State Department officials. If they're trying to rig an election in Tanzania because they don't want the political opposition party to win because they might reverse mining rights for a U.S. company there or for a London company there. So we want to make sure that group doesn't win the election. That State Department official will work with the Facebook liaisons, and they will pay using U.S. taxpayer dollars hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to these outside AI censorship developers who will topographically map in the language of that country what kind of words are associated with that political candidate, what trending narratives, what motivates them, what's the unique linguistic lexicon and dialect that they speak that distinguishes them from the establishment party candidate. And then they will have that entire lexicon, that entire code book throttled and de-amplified so that these people are not able to spread their messages on what essentially has replaced media around the world, especially in second and third world countries who don't have a robust endogenous legacy media set. They all use Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, or there are popular forums unique to that country. And those will all have these AI censorship super weapons applied. So this is basically the El Dorado gold mine to be able to rig every election around the world. And so it combines the computer scientists, the social scientists who do this. So the computer scientists do the code. The social scientists do the sort of linguistic mapping of the dialect of the people that are trying to be censored, and the sort of political scientists, if you will, the political operatives, are the ones who are making the determination of that group at the top level. So this has reinvigorated the entire field of psychology and sociology here in the US, because they've always had a sort of physics envy that they're not real science. But now they are getting millions of dollars from the US government, tens of millions of dollars, actually over 100 million in the aggregate in the past 2 years. The whole field has been reinvigorated because it does have applicability if you plug it into the hard science of computational data science, of the algorithms.
I can see the story, and it's quite a horrifying situation. There was a woman called Laura Dodsworth who wrote a book called State of Fear about what had been engendered in the UK. And in the UK, they quite clearly had a group of behavioral scientists getting together to actually amplify the messages of fear about the COVID issues. And so that was extraordinarily effective. And so you can see at a big picture level, we've come a long way, even the last, as you say, 2 or 3 years. And probably none of us realize the extent to which this AI control is possible. And so it's just like you said with Gary Kasparov and Big Blue, we're still thinking Gary's going to win, when in fact there's no possibility with the tools that have been arraigned against everyone. And I suppose behind that as well, Mike, is the fact that there's a whole school of philosophy and education that came with the Frankfurt School from the 1920s and 30s through Germany that infected the whole of the education system, and then the communications schools. And so all that same philosophy has been embedded right throughout the state in the permanent bureaucracy. So there's a whole philosophy that comes with this, isn't it, as well, that's being promoted behind the scenes. And so we're in a very difficult situation. And I suppose it means that the work you're doing is so important. And just tell us, how is that work going, and how is the Foundation for Freedom Online getting funds, and what are your main projects and focus to, because it looks to me as though this is unbeatable. Would that be correct?
It looked unbeatable, I think, for a long time, because there was a lack of public awareness, not just in the general public, but even the people who, if activated and motivated might be in a position to do something, simply were so far behind on what was happening that they were functionally inert. That has begun to change in quite serious fashion. I would say that the year 2023 was the first year that freedom on the internet started winning. We had lost, I think, every year from 2016 through 2022. And a series of events started to happen in mid to late 2022 that set the stage for, I think, a very successful counteroffensive in 2023 that we're still riding the momentum of. When we had Elon Musk acquired Twitter and immediately disbanded the Trust and Safety Council. He fired the election integrity team in charge of censoring elections. He let go of about 75% of the workforce, and all those censorship layers had to be maintained by this worker bee army of censorship operatives within a platform. And Elon Musk has systematically carved so much of that out. Now, I know that they're creating a new center in Austin for trust and safety, and they claim they're hiring, I think, 100 people, which is actually a relatively small amount. I'm not sure how much of that comes from pressure from the EU on this new disinformation law there, which is maybe a separate topic. But I'll give you one example to show how we're winning in certain respects, which is that in September 2022, the Harvard Misinformation Review, which is the proprietary censorship journal at Harvard, they literally have an entire monthly journal that every month publishes the sort of best-in-class censorship thought leadership on the best way to censor the internet. And in September 2022, they published a piece saying disinformation studies is now too big to fail. Now, disinformation studies is just a nice way of saying censorship operations. Harvard University has 4 separate centers dedicated exclusively to internet censorship, including the centers within the Belfer Center there, within the Shorenstein Center, the Kennedy Center, and the Berkman Klein Center. They have a vast, sprawling censorship infrastructure that connects into every single tech platform and into the government, so that these university centers, which are run by former intelligence agents. I'll give you an example. The Belfer Center, which is a big part of censoring the 2020 election, they were one of the deputized disinformation flaggers of our Department of Homeland Security. The Belfer Center at Harvard is run by a guy who was the former chief of staff to the Pentagon. That is the gatekeeper. The chief of staff is a shadow power of the government department. In many respects, they can often hold more power than the actual secretary themselves, because they control all the flow to the secretary. And before he was the chief of staff at the Pentagon, he ran the largest intelligence unit for the U.S. Army, which won an award from the CIA for being the best intelligence outfit in the military. So he's running the Harvard Center in charge of censorship. So once again, you have this sort of military thumb on the press of civilian politics and civilian speech, so that civilians can't vote out the military policy.
Well, it's just interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things that I realized as I started looking behind some of these different communication departments at Harvard and Penn and University of Virginia and so forth, is these are enormous and well-funded groups. And there's hundreds of academic staff, there's thousands of students, and there's an academic credibility that comes from the designation associated with those things. Well, Harvard says this is misinformation. And in fact, there's a philosophy behind that actually is hidden. And one of the things that's so difficult is that it's actually hard to get at any reasonable definition of misinformation or disinformation. But this has become widely used. And in Australia, we're about to have laws enacted here that are impossible, that it'll be handed to a central government, a communication group, to decide what's misinformation and disinformation. And of course, in every case, whatever the government says is always correct. And anyone who says anything other than that is spreading misinformation or disinformation. So we're trapped in a legal process that's going to make it almost impossible to get independent information out into the Ethernet as well. But you feel as though there's some hope here, and that we've got some way of being able to overcome all the forces against us.
Here in the US, things are a little bit different than in Australia. Australia there's a lot of pressure from the US State Department, and there are dirty tricks that can be applied with less scrutiny, to twisting the internal affairs of Australia. We still have a First Amendment in this country. We still need to maintain at least some modicum of a fiction around free speech. That way we can sanction other countries when they don't allow our sort of CIA or State Department assets into their country. So we have a little bit more of a tightrope walk that we need to dance along on these things. But I've sometimes jokingly referred to Australia as a extended CIA Air Force base with kangaroos on it. I don't mean that I only say that because it's a funny image to think about. But the fact is the US State Department has worked very hard to push Australia towards a lot of the censorship positions that it has. Part of that is because of the utility of Australia in many US operations around the South China Sea, and vis-a-vis our diplomacy and economic interests there. And any group that might rise to power in Australia that might challenge or reverse course or put less of Australians' own money and resources towards those causes that NATO wants them to is therefore a threat to our national interests. And we seek to essentially do a mind virus of Australian society for that purpose. I watched this happen in Europe. When I started on this in late 2016, I spent almost my entire life for the following years buried inside the Zoom calls and meetings and live streams of all the major NATO organizations as they plotted to twist the internal politics of European countries to contort them into passing these initial censorship laws like in Germany, NetzDG in 2017, and several others, in order to stop populist parties from rising to power who might challenge or provide less funding to NATO. I mean, I watched that happen real time in HD 4K, if you will. And I've seen all of the white papers around Australia and New Zealand in the same respect, using the same language, having the same sort of panel discussions. And in fact, I would not be surprised if half of the Australian NGOs and universities who are pushing this are getting money from the US State Department, USAID, or the National Endowment for Democracy.
No, it makes sense actually, and I like the idea of Australia as extended CIA base, Air Force base with a lot of kangaroos. I think that's a nice way of thinking about ourselves, because I think you can see there's a lot of manipulation going on behind the scenes, and it's certainly very hard to see how we can win. We the people, to go back to the US Constitution, we the people can overcome this. And I suppose one of the first things is the fact that the issue of the US government's involvement in the censorship of free speech, and particularly in messages that have gone out to all the big tech companies about suppressing various information, that will be an important outcome from the Supreme Court. But are there other things that will protect the ability for us to be able to have conversations like we're having, and for them to appear on the internet as we look to the future, Mike?
Yeah, so the censorship industry was created out of something they call the whole of society model. Now, the whole of society model ties together 4 different categories of institutions to all work as a seamless web, to all be basically fused into the nucleus of a single cell, so that they can all put their own unique resources and pressure towards a common censorship outcome. And those 4 categories are government institutions, private sector institutions like the tech platforms and like blue chip company corporate social responsibility funds, or like private censorship mercenary firms. Then you have the third category, which is this so-called civil society. Those are the university centers. Those are NGOs, nonprofits, and activist groups. And then the fourth category is allied news media and fact-checking organizations. And so those 4 together have formed this whole of society censorship industry. And my philosophy on this has been, what's needed is to create a whole of society freedom bloc, one that ties together are the allies for free speech on the internet within government, our allies within the private sector, our allies within civil society, and our allies within the media. That has been my personal life quest for the past many years now at this point. And I can report from the field that we have had a banner year last year. And I'll just again run through these. You had Elon Musk taking over Twitter, and don't underestimate that. Twitter, even though it is the smallest platform by size, in the sense that it only has something like 500 million monthly active users, whereas Instagram has, I think, 2 billion, and YouTube is the second most trafficked site on the whole internet, second only to Google.com. But it is where thought leadership happens. It's the only platform that allows just anybody to be a producer that can share in a totally open way. Facebook posts never have the virality of that because of the closed system of Facebook. Only less than 1 in 1,000 people are YouTube creators versus consumers. So there's no, even YouTube users are not YouTube thought producers in that sense. And the changeover of Twitter from being as censored as every other platform to allowing all manner of free speech. The entire COVID orthodoxy was broken essentially when Elon Musk acquired Twitter, and suddenly the largest political thought leadership platform on the country in the world, you were allowed to say whatever you wanted, and the reinstatement of almost all of the major banned accounts and the firing of the censorship teams. That was a huge event. Then you had the House turning over. So that's the chamber of our government that controls the purse strings, the expenditures. It also is in charge of investigations. And so all through 2023, there were something like 12 or 13 separate congressional hearings, as well as armadas of subpoenas into all of the major government agencies that were carrying out that censorship, meaning they had to turn over their books, which meant we had huge waves of news cycles around it. It became a field that was scandalized. There were major lawsuits, not just the Missouri v. Biden case, but there were court lawsuits brought by groups like America First Legal And so there was a combined judicial, legislative, policy, legal, and media counteroffensive. And I brought up Harvard initially because in September 2022, they put out the Harvard Misinformation Review said disinformation studies were now, quote, too big to fail, getting themselves to essentially Citibank or JP Morgan Chase during the 2008 financial crisis, which was no matter how dirty they were, no matter how corrupt, no matter how broken, no matter how many scams it was built on top of, you can't stop us now because we're getting all this government money. Just 1 year later, 12 calendar months later, in September 2023, the Washington Post wrote a panic piece saying disinformation studies were now in shambles because of the combined pressure of the legislature, of Jim Jordan in our Congress with the hearings and subpoenas and compelled transcribed interviews, to the lawsuits, to the media pressure, to the point where people were leaving the field because money was drying up and because they didn't want to face the media pressure of having to talk about what they were actually doing. So they've now moved to restructure the censorship industry in order to deal with that. And we are now in an evolutionary arms race against that next evolution. That next evolution is in many respects scarier because they are now moving into things like using the state governments to compel things like media literacy, which is one of the kid cousins of this civic listening scam that we talked about. Civic listening, as you mentioned from our FFO report, is this idea of citizen snitch networks to mass report in areas that the censorship industry can't access themselves, so that your friends and family are telling on you even when the CIA can't get to you. But media literacy, those groups running those civic listening core are also highly involved in something called media literacy, which a lot of people see that phrase.
No, it's shocking because these are basically all Marxist groups trying to promote Marxist philosophy through the whole of the education system. So media literacy has got the thumb firmly on the scale, hasn't it, about what's going to be accepted. And
completely.
And Mike, that brings me to the story of fact checkers. I've only just done a few days research in the last little while, but it looks as though there's actually no fact-checking organization that has any credibility as far as I can see, because they all come with a worldview or funds or directions that are actually putting a particular philosophy or direction. Is there any fact checkers that you believe that actually are doing worthwhile work that we can actually take some direction from?
No, not a single one, not even close. The whole field exists as a scam. The whole field exists because they lost the 2016 election. They lost the Brexit referendum in the UK. And so there was a transatlantic capacity building of a field of fact checking. Let me make this perfectly clear. None of the major fact checking groups, none of them are independent from our government. The Poynter Institute, the largest, the umbrella fact-checking group under which all of the major fact checkers are folded, got something like 24 grants from the US State Department to be able to rig the internal news cycles of major countries around the world. They work very closely with everything from the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA cutout, to USAID, which is our State Department and our intelligence services major money laundering conduit. And they're a total arm of the state. And the whole field only exists because they lost the election.
No,
And
I realize that it's an extraordinary story, isn't it? Because you set up a whole situation to deny reality, and then you call it fact checking. But Mike, just as we come to a sort of an end of our interview, and I'm really thankful for your time, how do you see then the possibility of even having a fair election in 2024? I know that I've seen some of that data that shows from the 2020 election that Google amplified or suppressed various searches that pushed people into the Democratic story and into the Democrat wing, and that was worth really hundreds of thousands, or in some cases millions of votes. And so how is it looking for the coming election? It looks worrying to me.
Yeah, you essentially need to be winning by such a large margin that even a heavy amount of rigging is not enough to overcome it. And that happens when the contradictions are so heightened that there's effectively a mass abandonment and psychological immunization from the propaganda of the rigging side. And one thing that I'll say is, despite all of their censorship, and in fact, probably because of all of their censorship over the past several years, you have had a transition from so many previously establishment, or in the US, you might say left, center left type people, like Elon Musk, who had primarily contributed to Democrats, or Joe Rogan, who had always considered himself a Democrat, or Snoop Dogg just came out and endorsed Trump. 50 Cent came out and endorsed Trump. These are all people who, Elon Musk was not a right-wing populist 4 years ago. Joe Rogan was not a right-wing pop. They didn't come out and say it explicitly, directly. And at some point, the persecution apparatus persecutes so many people that it finds itself isolated and alone. And you can make the argument that's a story that happened to the Roman Empire. You can, I myself am Jewish, but I think that there is something to be said about the fact that the story of the sort of crucifixion and persecution of a religious group, and then 300 years later, the entire empire has that religion, is the story of how persecution can backfire on regimes, even when they're outright killing people for their beliefs.
Yeah, I think if you look at just the Netherlands as one example of where, if government keeps on locking down and suppressing and acting against farmers, there's a revolt not only by farmers but the whole community. And we're seeing some similar things happen in Europe. The old saying, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but not all the people all the time, comes to mind here, doesn't it? Because ultimately there is going to be a reaction against this, and people can't be told that black is white for too long to think, wait a minute, I don't think black is white. So it's quite encouraging to see that. And I think it's going to be a very tough period leading up to the election, because you can see that the alarm is being sounded, and people saying the most extraordinary thing about President Trump and democracy, and trying to suppress this and do that. And it's the language in some of the mainstream media is so extraordinary that people are starting to think, wait a minute, what's going on here? And even the legal cases against Trump have backfired in that way. So it's a bit encouraging, Mike. You've given me some hope. But can we just conclude with a few tips for individuals about their own communications? What advice do you have for people about their own communications as they go about their day-to-day lives and interact with social media and so forth?
It's tough because the digital forensics tools available not just to governments and intelligence services, but even to these so-called researcher groups and independent content moderation teams and law enforcement, you name it, has basically made every channel of communication. I'm not sure that privacy is a luxury that everyday citizens have. A lot of people use encrypted chat apps like Signal in order to not have all their communications, such as their text messages, just able to be tapped at any time. There is some evidence that Signal as a messaging app is secure. For example, there have been these mass persecutions of protesters for our January 6th protest around the election 3 years ago. And for people's regular text messages to each other, they were all quickly obtained by the FBI when they were using regular SMS. I think what I'm trying to say is there are levels. There's lots of privacy tools. You can use a VPN to try to hide your IP address. You can use an encrypted chat app to make it less able for governments or intelligence services to be able to see what you're saying. But at the same time, those have become liabilities, because now prosecutors have started to cite the use of those apps as a motive for illicit activity, because prosecutors have started to make the argument that if you use privacy software, you're doing it because you knew you were or might be committing an illegal act and therefore wanted to do it. So whereas 5 or 6 years ago, I was advocating people use privacy software everywhere, now that I've seen that used against the ordinary, average law-abiding folks who are strung up on false charges by a vengeful regime, I'm not sure if that's sound counsel anymore. What I'd say is just is speak more freely in a closed private room, perhaps, than you do in a digital sense.
That's very good advice. I think it's what you're saying is it's almost impossible to beat this. A boss of mine 25 years ago gave me some great advice. He said, never put in an email anything that you won't be prepared to see on the front page of your local paper and not be embarrassed. And it was good advice in terms of basically don't assume that anything you say is private. And so I suppose that's what we've got to, we're in a situation where that's the world we live in now, Mike. And so it's a very significant and challenging time. Thanks for the great work you're doing with your foundation. It's been really helpful to understand some of the background. I'll point people towards this report and the report on civic listening called, subtitled, Political Informants and Citizen Spies Rebranded. I'll put a link to that. And Mike, I'd really like to talk to you a little bit later in the year in relation to just what's happening around communications and the elections as things start to fall out there. And I think we're going to see a lot of turmoil and challenge in the US, aren't we?
Yeah, we certainly will. It will be a roller coaster, but it'll be a great action movie. We'll try to find comedy where there's not tragedy. So anyway, have a great day. Thanks for the conversation, Ruben.
No, thank you. Thanks so much for taking the time, and all the best.
Cheers.
Bye.